Good evening. My name is Harold Mendelson, and this is week 5 of History 701D02, and this is the video presentation for my topic. My topic is the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese on December 7th, and it was how the attack was planned, what were the options. Today people still ask these questions. Why didn't Japan do this? Why didn't Japan do that? This will go in to explain that to a certain extent. I will also give a very brief history as to why the United States was imposing embargoes on various topics when eventually the item it decided to finally embargo was oil, and that was in 1941. In 1931, Japan felt that it was going to be the major source and control of Asia. It felt that there was too much Western influence, and it had watched the nation of China be controlled by foreign interests, and this was not acceptable. So it invaded initially Manchuria and Mongolia. It put up basically a puppet government to make it look legitimate. In January 1933, when President Roosevelt took office, one of the first things he did was issue letters of condemnation on Japan's aggressiveness in China, in Manchuria and Mongolia. Other nations started to complain as well. What happened eventually, this upset the Japanese government to the point that they were a member of the League of Nations. They just got up one day and left. Said, we're not dealing with this anymore. We're done. It had secretly been building ships that exceeded the Washington Naval Treaty, while other nations were agreeing to do this. Japan was building bigger ships. They were also building a modern naval air force with their aircraft carriers. Things progressively got worse. In 1937, Japan, under a pretext of having been, some of the Japanese companies had been attacked and workers murdered, which was actually something they did themselves, invaded China and quickly overran most of the large cities in China. Particularly horrible was what would be termed by the media the rape of Nanking. Nanking at that time was the capital of China, and in the process of conquering that city, 300,000 or more Chinese civilians, men, women, children, babies, were slaughtered. Some in very, very brutal manners. Women were raped and then decapitated. It was just horrible. Babies would be thrown up in the air and bayoneted. This really upset the nations outside when they became aware of this. Again, at that point, the United States started issuing embargoes on various products. They quit selling their scrap iron to Japan. It needed the scrap iron to build its war machines and its industries. It had steel production, but you always need scrap iron or steel to help with the amount of steel you're producing. They were getting some of that from the iron ore and nickel and whatnot from Mongolia and Manchuria. But it was impacting them. They escalated their aggression against China. They refused to negotiate. They refused to withdraw from China. And so Roosevelt kept upping the ante with the embargo. Finally, in 1941, beginning of 1941, he had the ultimate embargo. That was the embargo on petroleum, oil. Without that, 98% of the oil that was coming into Japan stopped to come in. And their strategic supply of oil was only about 2 years' supply, and that was not nearly enough. So they immediately started to plot how they were going to prevent the United States and the United States Navy from going into part of the Pacific where the Japanese ships were traveling to go up and back from Southeast Asia and in what is now Indonesia, when it was a Dutch colony. Also, we were looking at attacking and heading south in the Solomon Islands. So, the oil embargo caused the Japanese to come up with a plan about attacking Pearl Harbor. Now, we're still 2,500 miles away from where the Japanese front line was, but that was still 2,500 miles closer than if they were on the West Coast. And they were concerned about the American battle wagons. Again, a lot of the military at that time didn't fully comprehend the effectiveness of carriers. And so they were focused on battleships. In fact, the Japanese had decided to build 3 super battleships. It was the largest ever built, 70,000 tons. Imagine that, 70,000 ton battleships. 18-inch guns, 18.1 inch to be exact. These ships were built in secret. They were released early 1942, and they were somewhat of a white elephant. Japanese never were able to deploy them properly, and they both would eventually be sunk. At any rate, when the Japanese Navy does anything major offensive operation, it's typical that the Japanese commanders, both the operational commander and the overall commander, would get some of their staff to write up a battle plan as if they were on the bridge executing this plan. And they would have in detail, they would have all the resources that were going to be needed, the time slots, how they would arrive, what they would do, and what assets they were going to need. And then the time span over which they would felt the operation would take place. Well, on Yamamoto's staff was a commander, Genda, Genda. We don't know much about him during the war, but after the war, from 1946 to 1951, an American historian had interviewed the staff, surviving staff of both Yamamoto and Nagumo. They get their take. And Genda, who had been silent through the whole war, I was at a point where he said, look, I've got nothing to lose here. All the people involved in this are dead. the Japanese Navy no longer exists, so I might as well tell my story. And he did. And you see, he received a lot of criticism by some other Japanese military leaders and also government leaders, because not enough was accomplished in the attack on Pearl Harbor, in their opinion. Nagumo said, my orders were to destroy the battleships. I did. I didn't have to do anything beyond that. And Genda, even though he had planned to do much more than that, he just kept his mouth shut, didn't say anything. He was loyal, even though he was taking some flack from it. Well, he kept his mouth shut, again, until after the war. And his plan was more involved. He was going to have 11 troop transports escorted, full of 30,000 troops. They would meet approximately where the air attacks came from. And then these guys on these transports were going to move south under cover of night, and with the idea that they would be in position to unleash their attacks on December 7th. Well, this, of course, maybe December 8th or 9th. And then invade the island, combine that with air attacks, and there would be at least 3, with the potential of having additional ones if it was needed. And after taking out the battleships and the carriers, then they would focus on the infrastructure within Pearl Harbor. These included the oil storage facilities. Well, as it turned out, Admiral Nagumo heard this plan and he just scoffed at it and said, no, we're not doing this. It's going to be too complicated. I'm going to have to split my forces up and have part of my task force protecting these 11 troop transports, and then I'll have to stick around and provide gunfire support for them and whatever air attacks. And I'm not prepared to lose that much resources. So that's not what I'm going to do. So that plan got squashed, and meantime he had another plan, which he would use 2 sorties that would take off and they would do the damage. And then we would indicate by having a few POWs that they would be able to talk in English to over the radio and say, look guys, we're here, we're prisoners, we're being treated okay, and we need to settle this. Well, none of that happened. It didn't work like that. The Japanese didn't get any prisoners, although the raid tactically was very successful. Strategically, that was questionable. There was no damage to the oil facilities. There was no damage to the submarine pens. 3 aircraft carriers are missing. We have no idea where they are. And hey, planes came back and they said, hey, this is great. We sunk all these battleships. So with that, Nagumo turned around. But if they would have followed Genda's plan, they would have changed location, but it would have been to move south off the coast of Oahu, west of that, and with the intent of being able to invade wherever they wanted to plan the invasion. Obviously, that was not done. Nagumo, his attitude was, hey, I did a great job. You wanted sunk battleships? You got sunk battleships. We're good to go. And I did it without losing anything. I lost 29 airplanes, 5 midget submarines. That's not a big loss for what we accomplished. And there was fall much into the realm of acceptable losses on the very low end. Well, again, once Jenner, after the war, had explained his philosophy, what he wanted to do, it's obvious that the Japanese military, the Navy, could have accomplished a lot more than what they did. But they had a man in charge who was very conservative and always being concerned about potential losses. So that's what happened there. Now, the end result was what happened. The Americans told the Japanese basically to go pound sand, we're not surrendering under any circumstances. And they had fought in several naval engagements, including the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was a tactical victory for Japan, but a strategic victory for the United States, because what it did was the Japanese were planning to have an amphibious landing at Port Moresby and defeat the Australians and the Americans who were there, stationed there. That never took place. The guy never got close enough. So we see that as an issue. We also see the fact that it was so conservative that not only was it not an advantage, it was a disadvantage. It was a disadvantage because they had a ship that had all of this material on it, and they couldn't use it because the bridge was out and the captain was dead. They could fix the captain's ship pretty easily, but they had to wait months to get this ship back on the road, or on the water. Maybe it's even correct to say in the water. So that's what happened there. I will post this video, and hopefully everything, you guys will do some reviews, and we'll go from there. I want to thank you and have a good evening. I'm looking forward to your reviews.